Day 267 of the Trump administration, and the Russia investigation tops our news tonight as it moves in closer to the president. NBC News has confirmed that former RNC chairman, former White House chief of staff Reince Priebus of Wisconsin met with special counsel Robert Mueller's team today. Priebus is the highest-ranking official to meet with the special counsel thus far. As Politico puts it tonight, quote, Priebus is seen as a key player in understanding the president's actions because he was present for many meetings, including discussions on firing former FBI Director James Comey and White House meetings with Russian officials. He was also privy to White House internal documents. We want to bring in our lead-off panel without any further delay on a Friday night. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and an MSNBC political analyst. Mika Ouyang, an attorney and former staffer for the House Intelligence and Armed Services Committees, and Matthew Miller, MSNBC justice and security analyst, former chief spokesman over at the Justice Department. Welcome to you all. Peter, I'd like to begin with you. Without knowing what was asked and what was answered in the session with Priebus, what can we tell by the fact that he was called?
Well, a couple things. One, of course, is that, the president has cast aside quite a number of senior staff in only 9 months in office. We've seen a bigger turnover in this White House in a shorter amount of time than any on modern record. And clearly, Mr. Mueller is going to harvest that. He's going to go to people who used to be on the inside, who are no longer in the inside, in order to find out what they know, what they're willing to tell him. Now, it is possible the president could assert, privilege over former aides, but that doesn't seem to have been the case here. And Mr. Priebus was involved in some really important issues that must be at the center of what Mr. Mueller is looking at, not least of which the firing of James Comey, the FBI director back in May, that may have been cause for some people to believe could be counted as obstruction of justice.
There was also that flight back from Europe on Air Force One and the drafting of a press release. Remind our audience why that's critical.
Well, that's right, exactly. There were these emails that had been discovered to Donald Trump Jr. from last year's campaign, in which the Russians offered to meet with him to provide incriminating information about Hillary Clinton on behalf of the Russian government. That's what the email said. When my newspaper, my colleagues at the Times, contacted the White House about that, President Trump was personally involved in the drafting of a statement to respond to that. And this initial statement was, to say the least, misleading, if not incomplete. It said that the meeting was about Russian adoptions, which was not, in fact, what was the advertised meeting, the purpose of the meeting, according to these emails. No mention was made in that statement of an offer from the Russian government to help Mr. Trump's campaign. And Mr. Trump was directly involved with that statement. I think clearly Robert Mueller wants to know about that.
And Peter, like all good White House correspondents, I have a second follow-up, and that is, how did Reince Priebus leave things with the boss and with the West Wing in general?
Well, he didn't have the happiest departure, you'll remember, of course. He was pushed out on a Friday, a rainy Friday, when the president went to New York and back. And Reince Priebus got off the plane in Andrews Air Force Base into a driving range, got into a car, and basically has disappeared since then. He's been very quiet, very low-key. He stayed loyal in the public sense to the president, has not gone out there and offered commentary or told us what he thought of what happened inside the White House or his own departure. But I think what you can speculate on, and some people around him have said, is that, he didn't have a happy time. He was not a Trump loyalist during last year's campaign. He was the RNC chairman of a party that didn't particularly want Mr. Trump as its nominee. And he was brought in as sort of a way of bringing the Republican Party together, and it didn't work out. He and the president didn't get along ultimately. In the end, he was not the chief of staff that the president ultimately wanted.
Mika, I do this to you all the time. You are not, as far as we know, a member of the Mueller legal team, yet I ask you to speculate about them all the time. What does this tell you about the Mueller effort that it has reached Priebus?
It means that they're getting closer and closer to the Oval Office itself. Now they have someone who's regularly going in and out of the Oval Office, who's consulting with the president on a daily basis about his activities, about what statements were drafted. Remember, when he was drafting the statement that Peter mentioned, he was on a plane on his way back from Europe, where he had had a private, long conversation, more than one actually, with Vladimir Putin before he got on that plane. People might want to know what Priebus knew about that conversation. It means that they're getting closer to being able to get the other White House staff, and we still have a long way to go in this investigation.
I forgot about that little pull-aside conversation with Putin. Mika, how does this work? It seems to me Reince Priebus was present for so much, somewhere between a Zelig and a Clark Clifford of modern-day politics, that is one day enough? Do they have the right to recall you? Might he have a second session with these folks?
He might. You know, as they get other information from other witnesses, they may call him back again to clarify. You know, this is them reporting that he has been talking to the Mueller team, but we don't know how many other conversations they've had. And I think until they get further along, they reserve the right to recall anyone.
All right, Matthew, is Priebus the kind of person they could be looking at to turn?
I think absolutely. If you look at all of the things, you know, starting with the 2016 campaign, and then especially in the White House that he was witness to, the firing of Jim Comey, what the president said about why he was going to fire Comey, that's very key. His motivation is key. Priebus was a witness to all of that. And obviously, the one thing that we don't know that Bob Mueller has yet is someone on the inside who is turned who will help piece this all together. He's got a lot of circumstantial evidence. He has memos, and he can put together testimony, but he doesn't have anyone yet that we know that's turned on the president. I think Peter's right. Reince Priebus has all the incentive in the world to turn on President Trump, given the way he was fired. But part of what we have to do here is read the tea leaves, and I think there's one very big tea leaf that tells us that he probably hasn't done that yet, and that's if you look at his attorney, he shares the same attorney with Don McGahn. It's very unusual in a case like this for two potential witnesses to share the same attorney. Don McGahn is still the White House counsel. He's not the president's personal attorney, but he's the White House attorney. It's very hard to believe that he could represent both, that Barry Berg, his attorney, could represent both McGahn and Priebus if Priebus had turned and was a witness against the president.
Hey, Mika, you're the House counsel for the purposes of this conversation. What do you make of that last point?
I think that's right. I think Priebus is cooperating, but at the point where they're starting to ask them questions, where they're setting them against each other, then they need to have separate counsel. Otherwise, their lawyers conflicted.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.